Right now, in the same country, in the same year, two different regulatory philosophies are colliding. California is telling large companies, know your emissions, disclose your climate risk. Washington is moving in the opposite direction, with the SEC proposing to rescind its federal climate disclosure rules. So is ESG dying in America? Not exactly. The real 2026 story is much more interesting. ESG isn't disappearing, it's becoming fragmented. And if you are a US entrepreneur, CEO, CFO, investor, or a global company doing business in America, this regulatory split could directly affect your cost of doing business. Hi, this is Indranil and welcome to the Spotlight Media and Technology, where you go beyond profession, beyond headlines, beyond borders. Today, we are decoding the biggest misconception around ESG in America.
Under the process just completed by the EPA, we are officially terminating the so-called endangerment finding, a disastrous Obama-era policy that severely damaged the American auto industry and massively drove up prices for American consumers. That's why, effective immediately, we're repealing the ridiculous endangerment finding and terminating all additional green emission standards imposed unnecessarily on vehicle models and engines between 2012 and 2027 and beyond.
Federal rollback does not necessarily mean corporate climate disclosure is over. Let's break down what is actually happening. Let's start with California. Two laws are at the center of this story: SB 253 and SB 261. SB 253, the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, targets companies with more than $1 billion in annual revenue that do business in California. And here's the important part: it isn't limited to companies headquartered in California. A company can be headquartered in Texas, New York, India, Europe, or anywhere else and still fall with the law if it meets the requirement and does business in California. The law requires annual greenhouse gas emission disclosures that includes Scope 1, direct emissions; Scope 2, emissions associated with purchased electricity, steam, heating, and cooling; and eventually Scope 3, emissions throughout the wider value chain. California's framework is therefore moving beyond simply asking how much carbon does your factory produce. It is increasingly asking, what does your entire business ecosystem look like? And that is a much harder data problem. Now here's an important 2026 development. California's Air Resources Board (CARB) initially established August 10, 2026 as the first reporting deadline for Scope 1 and Scope 2. But on June 24, 2026, CARB announced that it intended to defer that first deadline to November 10, 2026. Why? CARB withdrew its initial regulation from the California Office of Administrative Law to make limited clarifications and give companies additional time before the reporting requirements take effect. So, for businesses watching this, November 10 is the proposed new deadline, not something companies should interpret as permission to stop preparing. And Scope 3 reporting remains scheduled to begin 2027. That's critical because Scope 1 and Scope 2 can largely be mapped internally. Scope 3 often means going outside the four walls of your company: suppliers, logistics, business travel, employee commuting, purchased goods, and potentially much more. This is where the compliance challenge gets significantly bigger. Now let's talk about SB 261. This one has a lower revenue threshold. More than $500 million in annual revenue for companies doing business in California. It requires covered companies to publish a climate-related financial risk report every 2 years. But there's a major legal complication. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals issued an injunction against enforcement of SB 261 in November 2025 while the litigation continues. Importantly, the court did not similarly enjoin SB 253, so don't confuse the two. SB 253 remains the immediate emissions reporting issue. SB 261 remains tied up in litigation. That distinction matters enormously for corporate compliance teams. Now let's turn to Washington. In March 2024, the SEC under the Biden administration adopted its climate-related disclosure rules. The rules were designed to standardize certain climate-related information in public company filings, including material climate risk and, in certain circumstances, greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. But the rule was almost immediately caught in litigation. On April 4, 2024, the SEC stayed the rule pending judicial review. Then, on March 27, 2025, the SEC voted to stop defending the rule in court. And now the story has moved another step. On May 29, 2026, the SEC formally proposed to rescind the climate-related disclosure rules altogether. The proposal was published in the Federal Register on June 3rd with comments due August 3, 2026. SEC Chairman Paul Atkins framed the proposal around a more materially focused approach to securities disclosure. In other words, the SEC's current direction is focus on financially material information rather than creating a broad climate disclosure regime. That's a fundamental policy shift. Here's where the headline becomes misleading. You may see SEC roll back climate disclosure and conclude ESG is over, but that's not what the regulatory map actually shows. Because California is still moving forward with its own disclosure framework. The European Union continues to operate its own sustainability reporting architecture, although the EU has also been simplifying and narrowing some requirements. And investors, banks, insurers, and major corporate customers can still demand environmental and climate information voluntarily or contractually. So what is disappearing is not necessarily climate information. What's disappearing at the federal level is potentially a single national regulatory baseline. And that distinction is enormous. Imagine you are the CEO of a company with $2 billion in annual revenue. You are headquartered in Texas. You sell products across the United States. You have suppliers in Asia. You have customers in Europe. And you do business in California. Washington may not require you to follow the SEC's climate rule if the proposed rescission becomes final. But California can still require emissions disclosure under SB 253 if you fall within its scope, and your European operations could create additional sustainability reporting obligations. Suddenly, your problem isn't, do I have to report ESG? Your problem becomes, which jurisdiction requires what and when? That's regulatory fragmentation. And here's the irony. Deregulation at the federal level doesn't automatically mean lower compliance cost for every large company. Sometimes fragmentation can actually increase complexity because companies have to build different processes for different jurisdictions. And this is where the Spotlight Media and Technologies perspective becomes important. We don't see this simply as an argument between pro-ESG versus anti-ESG. That's too simplistic. We see it as a governance, risk, and resilience question. For a business leader, the critical question is, can you produce reliable information about your own environmental and climate exposure? Because whether the SEC requires it or not, your investor may ask, your customers may ask, your lenders may ask, your insurers may ask, and your international regulations may ask. So the smart business strategy isn't necessarily, let's wait until the government tells us what to do. It's, let's understand our material risk and build the data infrastructure once. Then adapt that infrastructure to whichever jurisdiction requires it. If you are running a US company, here's our practical view. Number 1, know your exposure. Look at your annual revenue. Look at where you operate. Look at where you sell and understand whether California's Nexus requirements apply to you. Number 2, don't wait for November. If you are potentially subject to SB 253, start building your Scope 1 and Scope 2 inventory now. The deadline may have moved, the data problem hasn't. Number 3, build your multiple jurisdictions. If you are already operating globally, don't build a California-only system. Build an emissions and sustainability data architecture that can support multiple reporting requirements. Number 4, treat ESG data as business intelligence. Don't think only about compliance. Think energy efficiency, supply chain resilience, insurance exposure, operational risk, capital allocation, customer expectations. That's where ESG becomes commercially relevant. So let's come back to our opening question. Is ESG dying in America? Our answer is, that's a wrong question. The more accurate question is, who is regulating it? Where and why? Washington is moving toward a narrower materiality-focused federal disclosure philosophy. California is continuing to build a large company climate disclosure framework, and global companies are navigating international requirements at the same time. So the center of gravity is shifting from one federal rulebook to a more complicated ecosystem of states, markets, investors, customers, and international regulators. That's not necessarily the disappearance of ESG, it's decentralization and fragmentation. And for entrepreneurs, fragmentation can be more challenging than a single rule, because the winning strategy isn't to bet that ESG disappears. It's to build systems that can adapt, build once, measure accurately, govern the data, and adapt the reporting to the jurisdictions. That's what resilience looks like. And that's our strong view at the Spotlight Media and Technology. ESG shouldn't be treated as paperwork. It should be treated as business intelligence, risk management, and governance infrastructure. California didn't simply win. Washington didn't simply kill ESG. The rules are moving in different directions, and businesses are caught in the middle. The companies that understand that reality early will have an advantage over those still debating whether ESG is alive or dead. If you are navigating ESG regulation, climate disclosure, governance, or sustainability strategy at your organization, we help companies with ESG strategy and communication. Link in the description. This is the Spotlight Beyond Profession, decoding business, market, policy, sustainability beyond the headlines, beyond profession, beyond headlines, beyond borders. Thank you very much for watching and signing it off.